to Seeking Rents, the podcast. I am your host, Jason Garcia. I am the publisher of Seeking Rents. That is a newsletter about Florida politics with a particular emphasis on the ways that big businesses and other special interests influence public policy in this state. We start every show with a quick explanation of that name, Seeking Rents. It comes from a term in economics called rent seeking. And rent seeking is what's happening when someone with lots of wealth and influence, like a big business or a billionaire, uses that wealth and influence to get laws changed in their favor in a way that allows them to capture even more wealth and influence for themselves, usually at the expense of someone else. So I'm excited about today's show. I'm going to be joined by Nate Monroe, the columnist, the Florida columnist for USA Today's Florida newspapers. He's based in Jacksonville with the Florida Times Union in Jacksonville. Nate is one of my favorite people in state politics. We've worked together on a few stories over the years, including just recently, both of us were working together on stories about how lobbyists for television stations and television station owners are helping the DeSantis administration out with its taxpayer-funded campaign against Amendment 4. That's the constitutional amendment that would overturn Florida's 6-week abortion ban, near total abortion ban. That's the abortion ban that Ron DeSantis himself signed into law about a year ago. So we talk a bit about that. We have some pretty good fun conversations, if I do say so myself, about some of the biggest bullies in Florida politics fighting with each other. And we learn a little bit about, hear Nate's perspectives with Ron DeSantis before he was governor. Nate was one of the guys who was ahead of the curve, sort of calling out and predicting that the myth and self-image that Ron DeSantis had built up for himself in Florida would not survive the national stage. And he was very right about that. So before we get to that, a few plugs. If you haven't already, please think about signing up for the newsletter. Easiest way to find us is at seekingrentsfl.com. Subscriptions are free. None of our stories or podcasts are behind a paywall, but there is an option to voluntarily pay for a subscription if you can afford one. If you've got the means, please think about doing that. The revenue we get from voluntary paid subscriptions are super helpful, and they help us cover the costs of various reporting expenses like public records requests. And then lastly, this is wild to me, but I have joined TikTok. Hello, youth. Here I am. So I'm still sort of figuring out how that works. But if you would like to see me pretending to be a lot younger than I actually am, check us out on TikTok. I don't even know how to give a TikTok address right now. So just look for Seeking Rents on TikTok and for the guy who's clearly has no idea what he's doing and you found us. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get right to the interview with Nate. Nate Monroe, welcome to the show.
Jason, thanks for having me, man.
Yeah. I've been looking forward to this since we booked it. So I think I want to start with the Amendment 4 stuff, just because that was a story you and I were both working on together some. And I guess for folks that haven't paid attention, I imagine most people here do, but both of us worked on a story about the Florida television stations and then the lobbying group for station owners sort of co-sponsoring these what are essentially state campaign ads against Amendment 4, which is the amendment that would overturn the state's abortion ban if voters approve it. And so we were trying to get answers as to why on earth are television stations helping out with this campaign? It seems like they're essentially contributing to a campaign to keep abortion banned in Florida. So let me throw this out to you. What got you interested in that story and sort of tell me, what's your, having gone through the process of trying to report it out, what's your sort of take on what exactly is going on here?
Yeah, I mean, so, and it's possible that you and I got into this in a similar way. Part of it was just looking at the ad and seeing it, the Agency for Healthcare Administration, which is kind of the vehicle through which the governor has exercised some legally questionable influence over the public discourse.
Very diplomatic.
He's used ACA to kind of launder political messages out into the world, and ACA had tweeted out this apparent television ad that it had released. And I noticed on the first go through that it had this, and, reporters are at least political reporters in Florida are kind of used to looking at the little taglines at the bottom of political ads that say sponsored by X, Y, and Z. Political campaigns and political committees, when they run ads, there are certain rules they have to follow, disclose, sponsor certain things. And so it stood out to me. And then on top of that, I had someone I sort of respect had messaged me about this and said, dude, did you see this? It's super weird. And that kind of, my own observation combined with someone I have some respect for saying, hey, I found this weird too, kind of motivated me to
Yeah,
just go
right.
email the Florida Broadcasters Association, which had apparently sponsored the ad. And in addition to this local broadcaster, so I emailed them and quickly found that they were evasive at best. I never got a response
Right.
from them. And I think got a kind of non-response to my questions about their sponsorship of the ad from ACA. So it was like,
Right, right.
yeah, so that struck me as really weird. Is like, why is the Broadcasters Association even making looping ACA in on a question I'd have for them in the first place? That just struck
Right.
me bizarre.
Yeah, that's wild. I had sort of the same experience where, kind of like you, it was just that disclaimer you immediately notice. You're like, what's going on here? And so just like fired off a quick note while doing other stuff, right? Like thinking there's probably easy to get an answer. You just send a note to the broadcasters and never heard from them again. Like not radio silence completely. And I actually forgot about it for a few days because of that. There's just so much other stuff going on. And it wasn't until the ads started showing up again that I was like, how the hell do we not know why these guys are sponsoring this thing? And that's where it led back to. And the point you're making too, that's, this goes beyond just like the sponsorship. If they're like actively coordinating with Aki here too, or if you're reaching out to the broadcasters lobby, a private entity with questions, and then they're turning around and forwarding your questions and having Akka respond to you. That's an Akka for, 50% of the podcast listeners will know exactly what that is. The other 50%, that's the Agency for Healthcare Administration. That's a state agency that's supposed to be like regulating hospitals and healthcare facilities, and is right now essentially waging a campaign against Amendment 4. What was your, obviously these groups, the Broadcasters Association wasn't super helpful. What did you sort of come away from? Like, what was your best understanding of what's going on here? Like, why are they doing this?
I mean, frankly, that is the question, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
think I've got nothing but maybe some speculation about that. I
Right.
mean, I think a thing you and I just know about the nature of lobbying, trade organizations and industry lobbying organizations in Florida is that at some point you're going to lobby the state for things that your industry
Right.
needs. And as you and I started digging into this, I mean, something that became clear to me is that the Florida Broadcasters Association really relies on revenue that it collects from public service announcements. It sells discounted airtime to certain state agencies for public service announcements. And these are really supposed to be very anodyne, unremarkable
Right.
things, don't drive drunk, or how to install, make sure you're installing child safety seats the right
Right.
way, and stuff that's not
Get
supposed to
ready
be.
for hurricanes.
Right. And so I mean, that association is a nonprofit that represents, Florida's broadcast interests. And that means virtually all television news stations. I imagine the lion's share of like radio stations, certainly radio news stations, all the like,
Right.
many of the NPR affiliates in the state. And so, I mean, but so on one level, I understood it. The thing that remains a mystery to me, though, is why some of these stations are not, at least outwardly and publicly, taking steps to separate themselves from this advertisement. Because
Right.
the TV ad says it's sponsored by ACA, it's sponsored by the Florida Broadcasters Association, and then also sponsored by this local station. So
Right.
presumably whatever station people are watching. I, that is the part that I still find a bit, sort of puzzling. I mean, that is, I mean, my thought when I first saw the disclaimer and the sponsorship note at the end of the ad was less about the financial trickery going on here about like discounted ad time, and it was more just like, wow, they're using the credibility of a public service
Right.
announcement to bolster the content of this ad. Like they're using this association with like a news station to make this ad seem like something it's not. And that's the part that I found, really troubling initially, and still do find troubling.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. There's another thing that I found troubling about this was this idea, like you mentioned, this is the Broadcasters Association is a lobbying group. They routinely they need favors from state leaders. Like I think we both had this example in our stories about just a couple of years ago, the broadcasters lobby had gone looking to the DeSantis administration for permission to be able to charge higher rates to certain kinds of political advertising, right? So this is an entity that actively seeks favors from the DeSantis administration. So, for the DeSantis administration to turn around and kind of leverage that relationship to get airtime for its, what the governor is calling PSAs, but which any normal person will look at and think is a political ad. That's like, it maybe it's not illegal, but it's certainly an abuse of sort of position right there as far as I'm concerned. I'm sort of curious, do you I don't even know what question I'm looking for other than like, don't you agree sort of thing. But what, you know, another, did you ever get any answers out of the DeSantis administration out of this? Like, we know the broadcaster didn't say anything. And then I think I'm asking a question that I'm going to have the least surprising answer to ever. But yeah,
Yeah, I
what was
mean,
the reaction from them?
yeah, I mean, nothing substantive. I mean, I guess twice have gotten what are technically responses to communications that I've sent them. They did not answer questions in
Right.
any meaningful sense. Yeah, I mean, you're touching on something here. I mean, I do want to be clear about this. This television ad is not a public service announcement. Like
Right.
this is, and I'm wearing my columnist hat here, but I mean, this is an abuse of a system that is intended to be providing the public with like a resource. This is a, I mean, even the television ad is less explicitly political than ACA set up a website that
Right.
we probably should have talked about that has language bashing Amendment 4 directly, casting aspersions on groups
Right.
that have donated to or support Amendment 4's passage. And so the ad directs viewers to that website. So, but it's still not as quite as explicitly political as the website. But nonetheless, like it presents as not a normal public service announcement. I mean, it's got a very defensive posture to it. It's sort
Right.
of apropos of nothing, defending the state's abortion policies. It
Right.
characterizes the state's 6-week abortion ban as something that's very compassionate and supportive of women without
Right.
mentioning that you can't get an abortion after 6 weeks. So
Right.
it's a deceptive political ad.
Right.
And my understanding, I mean, I have talked to, a source currently in the Florida broadcast industry. It is political enough that I think at least one station has not run the ad, or at least has not run the ad since being made aware of its contents because it's political in nature.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Yeah. So they clearly knew what they were doing. It's funny. The very few questions that Ron DeSantis has answered about this is he made sure to like, he was like, yeah, it's a PSA. And then like gets right into like election lawyer Ron DeSantis, where he's like, he doesn't explicitly advocate for anything. And you're right. The ad is very carefully done so that it is rebutting criticism that Amendment 4 supporters have raised without ever sort of mentioning the amendment itself. It's very careful not to do that. But then it ends with sending you to a website that like just explicitly savages Amendment 4 and says
Right.
it's dangerous for women. They knew exactly what they were doing to try and skirt the rules on this sort of stuff.
I agree, and I would actually even argue that the difference between the television ad and the website, like the fact that the ad is not as explicit as the website, I think is a kind of tacit admission by the state that they do know what they're doing,
Right.
that they're far more comfortable being political in the website than they are in a television ad using discounted airtime under a program that's really administered and overseen by the FCC. And
Right.
so like I think that the difference between the two is even a kind of acknowledgement in its own right that the messaging is quite political.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. They absolutely do. They couldn't just take the language from the website and put it in the TV ad, or else they'd get themselves into trouble. The other thing, it's interesting to hear that you mentioned that at least one station, once becoming aware of it, has not has decided not to air this thing. The thing that probably pissed me off the most in reporting the story, and I know we've talked some about this offline, but was how hard it was, and frankly, almost impossible it was to get answers out of television stations themselves. Like these are like journalistic entities, right? And they were refusing to answer like basic questions about, hey, why are you sponsoring this ad? And as far as I can tell, and I apologize to anybody if I've missed something, I'm not seeing a lot of like, television news stations digging into this. Like the example I think I used in one of our conversations was like if the Florida Press Association, I think that's the lobbying group for the newspapers, was donating like house ads or selling discounted house ads in papers around the state for this sort of thing. You can bet there'd be a bunch of newspapers around the state like drilling into that and writing stories about what's going on here, why they're doing it, what the law is, that sort of stuff. People would be putting that through a microscope. And you haven't seen any of that out of television stations. I'm curious to get your thoughts, because I know you ran into some of that same sort of silence from different stations. Why do you think that is? Why has it been so hard to get answers out of that side of the equation?
I mean, I agree. I had a similar experience reaching out to some broadcast folks, and I find it genuinely puzzling. Like you, I think if Florida newspapers had done something similar, I think there would be lots of vocal criticism about it. I do think that newspapers would be writing about it. I mean, and like back in the family ownership days of newspapers, like, the Florida Times Union was once owned by a pretty conservative Georgia family. And like, I can envision some scenario where like the Times Union had gotten sideways on some sort of goofy thing like
Right.
this. And like, we would have been pissed about it.
Right.
And so I mean, I find it perplexing myself. I think it's weird that there's not more of a kind of an outcry from the broadcast industry about it. Particularly some of the board members are news executives. And so, including some that, like I've reached out to and found deeply unhelpful with this story. So, I mean, I think that's not a good thing.
Yeah, right, right. Newspaper reporters would like take it as a badge of honor to like write critically about their own employer, right? Like as a little like sign that we're willing to stand up to anybody. The fact that
Yeah.
you're not seeing that same kind of dynamic is really disappointing, I guess is probably the best word. The last thing I want to ask about this is, because you've also written about this. This is part of a much larger campaign, and I think we did a show on this at some point talking about like all the different ways the DeSantis administration is kind of leveraging state power and resources. The most prominent way has been, sending election police door to door to folks who sign these petitions with like folders full of their personal information, including copies of their driver's license, and like interrogating them about whether or not they actually signed the petition. Tell me what do you make of what's going on here? How sort of, putting your columnist hat back on, like how sort of, over the line does it seem to you? I sort of wonder if we're going to start seeing the same kind of thing happen with Amendment 3. Like, are we going to start seeing like, and that's the marijuana amendment? Are we going to start see like DOT running like marijuana and driving ads or something? But, I'm rambling here, but tell me about sort of your take on the larger sort of effort by DeSantis to use like public resources against Amendment 4.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways this is the very real world culmination of something that we often talk about and write about in a really abstract way, which is like, conservative legal philosophies and views of executive power and like what is suspicion of democracy. And like, I think that this sort of maximalist effort that DeSantis is undertaking to kill these amendments, I mean, I think it certainly, this is what suspicion of voters and voters' preferences kind of looks like.
Right.
DeSantis is concerned about voters overwhelmingly approving something that he and the legislature find either morally reprehensible or politically inconvenient. I have my doubts about whether elected officials really care all that much about either abortion or recreational marijuana. I think this
Right.
is more political than anything, concern about the right-wing base. But like, I mean, I think, I'm not an attorney. I have plenty of sources who are. I can also like read statutes and use critical thinking, and like
Right.
some of the stuff the governor is doing is not lawful. Florida agencies and elected officials are not supposed to be using official taxpayer resources to affect the outcome of an election. And what ACA has done at the DeSantis administration's behest is very clearly using taxpayer resources to affect the outcome of an election.
Right.
And,
100%.
yeah. And so my question is, the Supreme Court, at least with Amendment 4, has a couple of cases now, or the Leon County Circuit Court has one and the Supreme Court has one. I mean, how far are they going to let him go?
Right.
He has ideological allies on the court. He has appointed 5 of the 7 members of the state Supreme Court. But being ideologically aligned with somebody and giving them license to act unlawfully, which is again like what has very obviously happened here, are two different things. And I really am curious how far are they gonna let him go?
Yeah.
he has certainly made it very difficult for some of his otherwise ideological allies on the court to throw him a lifeline. I think he has put them in an uncomfortable position if they do want to figure out how to not slap the governor.
Right, right. I just happened to be looking this up before we started this, and the DeSantis administration has to respond by the end of today to that Supreme Court case to try and justify some of their actions. I'm hoping at least we'll start to get some like specifics, and to that point, like he has appointed 5 of the Supreme Court justices, and a 6th one is as conservative as any of them, and is
Yes.
married to a future House Speaker that, if memory serves, one of the sponsors of the 6-week abortion ban. But the Supreme Court has also given him like wide latitude on stuff. Like they've not said peep to when he suspends elected officials in ways that no governor ever has. But they have at least, they have pulled him back at least once that I can think of, when he tried to appoint one of those Supreme Court justices. In fact, he literally broke the law, ignored a provision in the Constitution and tried to appoint her. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. He then waited and just did it a bit later. But so there is at least a little track record of calling him up short,
and the court did approve the marijuana and abortion amendments on the ballot in the first place. I mean, they had to sign off on that. And
that's right.
It was a divided court. But the court did do that. And that was something DeSantis still complains about.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, the court has shown an openness to not just placating every wish of the governor's office. There could be a lot of reasons for that. One of them might just be that the state very poorly advocated for keeping those off the ballot.
Right.
But we'll see. I mean, this is about as bright line a case as you can conceive of. You mentioned the suspended prosecutors. The court essentially did give the governor license to do that whenever he wants, with what I thought was some pretty dubious reasoning. But even that to me is a little bit different than what's going on here. I mean, at least there is a law that says DeSantis can suspend prosecutors for some reasons. Right. And that was a matter of interpreting the law. I think it was a bad faith and weird interpretation of the law. But like in that case, there's a law that says he can do it. And they said he can, under most circumstances, basically can do it. In this case, like there's a law that says he can't do something. He's right. doing this thing. Like it's just that simple. It really is that simple. Yeah. And so I think he's put them in an awkward position. I think they'd rather not have to be deciding a case like this.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Okay, I'm going to shift gears here because this is one I've been most excited to sort of get your take on. So for folks that don't know, you and I think the first time that we had known each other by like email and tweet and stuff, but the first time we ever really started working on each other, or like working with each other and talking to each other, got to know each other a little bit, was during that ghost candidate stuff and the way it kind of sprawled out into just all sorts of Florida politics scandals involving Florida Power and Light and some consultants that it was using to arrange, that were arranging a bunch of different scandals. Anyway, this is a very ham-handed setup for. Have you been paying attention to what's been going on with New College of Florida and the Board of Governors, where Eric Szilagyi, of all people, the former CEO of Florida Power and Light, the guy who essentially retired in what seemed pretty clearly as a response to all the scandal that happened under his watch, but he's still on the Board of Governors, and he's been giving Richard Corcoran the business a little bit. This is, as I think through, like, if you ask me to name, like, the 10 most powerful people or most consequential people in Florida politics over the last 15 years, particularly like non-elected official division or non-governor division, Eric Szilagyi and Richard Corcoran are on that list. And so suddenly, like, I guess that the old FPL CEO, the guy behind so much election shenanigans and political shenanigans, is now like the voice of like conscience for taxpayers with New College. I'm just sort of curious, what do you make of what's going on there?
Woke Szilagyi, man. Like, where was this guy when he was running FPL? Right. I love it. This late blooming progressive utility executive.
Right.
I have, it's funny. I have for a long time talked to, sources about FPL as you have. And one of the topics has often been FPL's relationship with DeSantis. I think that became salient a few years ago. DeSantis vetoed a solar bill that was the top priority of FPL going into legislative session. And this was a bill that would have kneecapped residential solar installation in the state. It would have made it less cost effective for people to do it. And At that time, I was sort of told by a person close with DeSantis that he had had a very frosty relationship with Salat, or that there was not really much of a relationship there is probably a
Yeah.
more accurate way to characterize it. And my only guess is that, it's not like, and I'll say this too, all the controversy about the consultants and the ghost candidates and some of the stuff with the Jacksonville utility here, I didn't see a lot of elected Republicans like standing up or defending FPL.
Right, right. Yeah, that's a good
Nobody,
point.
yeah, I mean, among the reactions we did not get from those, many stories was anyone saying, hey, Eric's a great guy, and how can you be casting these aspersions against his company? Like, nobody really, I
Right.
think everyone kind of stayed away from that. And
Yeah.
so I just look at it, and I mean, this is a guy who I think had, again, I've been told had no real relationship with DeSantis, which would also fit, by the way. I don't know that DeSantis has meaningful relationships with many people.
Yeah, I was
So
gonna say, right.
among other reasons that checks out. And so, yeah, maybe he's just kind of enjoying needling, the ultimate DeSantis toady in Richard Corcoran.
Yeah, that could be it. It's interesting. So it's interesting you bring that up, like, because I do remember in the 2018 governor's race, FPL was big into Adam Putnam. That was the guy DeSantis, who everybody thought was going to win the Republican governor's nomination for governor, and then Donald Trump upended everything and essentially installed Ron DeSantis as the nominee. But of course, like everybody was Adam Putnam in like kind of like conventional Republican power structure. And then it's clear that there's been some like hostility there because I forget the exact mechanics, but they passed over Szilagyi for chair of the board of governors, right? He was supposed to be, and they very conspicuously did not give it to him. So yeah, I wonder if it's that. It's interesting you bring up the point that there was nobody like really defending FPL and Szilagyi, and sort of more to the contrary, there were plenty of Republicans off the record willing to talk about how awful they thought the company and its people had been. I mean, I think I don't know if I should lay this at Szilagyi's feet himself or just like he and his like government relations team, but I think they had the reputation for them and the two sugar companies of being the biggest bullies in all of Florida politics for a long, long time. So I think you probably saw a lot of people enjoying them finally getting a little bit of that business. But yeah, watching him go after Corcoran, I don't know is it like reputation rehab here, or is it just like you say, is it just like having a bit of fun? You can tweak DeSantis with, I guess they've got no way to get him off the board of governors until his term is done or something.
Which at the same time, I feel confident if DeSantis really wanted him off, he could find a way to do it. I mean,
Right.
this is not a governor who feels obviously constrained by things like statutes or constitutional mandates. So maybe it's worth pointing out that, perhaps Eric Szilagyi is just genuinely concerned as a Florida taxpayer that this new college experiment is very expensive. I guess that's always in the realm of possibilities. But yeah, I mean, Szilagyi, I think I probably have some firsthand experience and can say I think
Oh,
he was.
right. Yeah, I wasn't even thinking about that stuff.
Yeah, I think he was a man possessed of some hubris as the CEO of that company, and that's certainly something I've heard about him over the years. So if he rubbed people the wrong way, I find that understandable. But I rub people the wrong way too. So
Right. Oh, and yeah, I got to tell you, people possessed of hubris. Richard Corcoran, man, that is not a guy lacking for hubris. Although I will say, one whose people seem to, be more devoted to him than in any way that I'd ever heard from other folks. Like it always amazed me. I actually wrote like a long profile of Corcoran for when I was working at Florida Trend magazine, and actually spent a lot of time really trying to like get inside that world and understand him. And like you came away from thinking about it like a lot of people despised Richard Corcoran, but the people that liked him were like devoted to him, and he sort of used that sort of loyalty as a real, like he weaponized that in a way or he took advantage of the fact that he had troops loyal to him essentially.
yeah. I mean, it's funny, the Szilagyi Corcoran thing. It's a little bit like the Randy Fine DeSantis thing, where it's like occasionally we just like to play out this very demented version of celebrity deathmatch, where it's like, who do you actually even root for here?
Right.
There's like never a good guy, and there's never a hero in a Florida story.
That's right. Well, the other thing I wanted to bring up, speaking of frosty relationships with DeSantis, like One of the things I remember actually having a conversation with another columnist, and it was after you had written a piece about Ron DeSantis. It's kind of after JD Vance had become the nominee. It was basically like Ron DeSantis in his like final act, and it was one of the most well written columns. Like the it was like almost poetry in different passages in it, and it reminded me of it. If I'm remembering correctly, you have some like pre-governor Ron DeSantis experience, and I've always, from my perspective, you have always written about him with more like just kind of authority and conviction than I think a lot of folks have. Like, I don't really know the guy. I know I've dealt with him once, basically, but maybe I'm curious to get your perspective on Ron DeSantis' evolution. So, like, what was he like before governor, and then just tell me a bit more about sort of how do you think how does this plane finally get on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, his story is really remarkable in the sense that when he was a congressman, he represented Northeast Florida. Now, sometimes something people from Jacksonville can get offended by, understandably. I may or may not be one of these people that there's a tendency to just sort of lump all of Northeast Florida together. And of course, it's made up of very disparate communities. So his congressional district came just to the south of the city, but he had ties here. He'd married, a person who was a television anchor at a First Coast News, which is one of the big three TV stations in Jacksonville. He was always a kind of local curiosity. When he was in office, like I've talked to people in City Hall here about DeSantis, and their view of him then was if we needed something from our congressional delegation, we had folks in both parties, Ted Yoho, Corrine Brown, who we could call or felt comfortable calling, or Al Lawson after her, to get some help on like port funding issues. DeSantis was just somebody that they didn't even really bother with. His office was like not super responsive, not very engaged in local issues. And I mean, I can say, just as someone who kind of generally reported on politics, I mean, he came in and talked to the editorial board a couple of times when he was a congressman. So he dealt with the media. I even remember asking him an off the record question one time that he answered. So his suspicion of unnamed sources on things now is kind of funny. And that was a question that was on over something very not interesting. But he was just kind of a curiosity. I don't think anyone ever really had a good handle on like what he was about. We'd see him on Fox News. I always kind of was aware he had a curiously tight connection with like Heritage Foundation people, but he just like, now that he's the governor, I mean, like you would be hard pressed to find any real sign that he had spent time at Northeast Florida. I mean, this is not a guy that like seemed like he had very deep ties to the area. And sure enough, he's not here anymore. And I think is, kind of a stranger in his own, quasi hometown.
Right, right. Yeah, you were sort of like, if I'm remembering, you kind of were ahead of the pack on this idea that like the sort of the image of Ron DeSantis that kind of built up over the course of his governorship, when he was able to, essentially control all access to him, and like almost all of his media encounters were from, these press conferences where reporters are in the back shouting questions that you can't hear, and he's got a microphone, so he's able to essentially, talk about another bully, essentially bully over people. You were one of the first people I sort of, if I'm remembering correctly, that kind of predicted that this would not work when he had to start dealing with people on a level footing, when he had to start meeting real people, encountering people as another actual human being. Am I remembering that right? And B, what if I am, what kind of led you to believe that?
I'm never going to disclaim credit for something, whether it's deserved or not. So I'm sure we're remembering it exactly right. Yeah. I mean, it was just a matter of like, again, I've seen him talk. I've seen him be interviewed in editorial board meetings. I mean, I just remember the pre-gubernatorial DeSantis, which was just like somebody who's like not he's not, Trump's talent is, whether you like him or not. I mean, he's an entertainer.
Right.
He's a deft reader of public opinion. He can read a room. Those are just things that like DeSantis like very obviously doesn't do.
Right.
I never got the sense when he would come and talk to us that I was like sitting down with a future governor. Uh,
Right.
and people also often forget he was briefly running for Rubio's Senate seat and then sort of very quietly just backed out of that when Rubio decided he was going to run again. I mean, this was not someone who seemed particularly brash or courageous. He could have run against Marco Rubio if he wanted that
Right.
Senate seat. And so, like, that was a thing. I also in Jacksonville, I mean, maybe one of the legacies he did leave here, one of the scant signs, was a trail of kind of pissed off former allies. There are political consultants here who had helped DeSantis become governor, and then were frozen out by him after. And that's, that is the thing. And this also happened in his congressional run. There were
Right.
consultants who didn't win Congress, and he froze them out too. And some of those folks are now working for Donald Trump, and were probably the architects of Trump's anti DeSantis push. So
Right.
that is a thing I also did sort of know about him. He has he had a complicated relationship, I think, with the last Republican mayor we had as well. I mean, we sort of had like an anti DeSantis crew in City Hall for a while.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. I didn't know that. My,
Yeah, just like a
okay.
very Susie Wiles aligned group of
Oh,
Republican
yeah.
Susie
Yeah. That makes
Wiles.
sense. That makes
Yeah,
total sense. Right.
I,
Right.
I assume people listening to this podcast will have some awareness of Susie Wiles, but like, that was sort of a dynamic that was always, I think, in the background
Yeah.
between
Well,
Lenny Curry and DeSantis.
that's going to give me an excuse to throw a fun DeSantis Susie Wiles story or two in the show notes in case people don't know, because that's a fun backstory. My experience with Ron DeSantis, I mentioned I don't have much. The only like time I ever dealt with him in any sort of depth was I was working for Florida Trend magazine at the time, and so for folks who don't know, Florida Trend it's a great magazine. It's a business news publication. It is a place that will like enlighten and explain. It will never challenge or investigate. If you're dealing with an interview with Florida Trend, it's going to be a fairly friendly ground. It'll be serious but friendly. And so like it was a friendly place that I was coming at, and it was like you couldn't envision a more friendly story. So he had already won the governor's race. And so we were it was going to be like a free cover story for this guy. And we just wanted the premise of, okay, what's this guy going to do? And I don't know for folks who remember when he ran that governor's race, he got elected and nobody even knew him really because the primary had been all about Trump. And then the general was all about Andrew Gillum, essentially, who was looking like not only were Democrats going to win Florida finally, but they're going to win with a guy who was about as far left as you could get. And so Ron DeSantis ended up winning, and nobody really kind of knew what was he going to do. And so the premise of this that we approached him with was, you kind of vaguely talked about, I think it was four priorities on the campaign thing. We just want to have an interview with you, like tell us, okay, now you're going to do it. What are some of the things you're going to do? And so I ended up spending, it was a little less, about a half hour on the phone with this guy, and I don't know if he could not or just would not go into any depth on any one of these issues. And again, these were all his issues, right? Like he could not get past the talking points on anything. And perhaps it was just because he didn't want to, right? Like you hear a lot about, I didn't walk away from the phone thinking like that's a socially awkward guy. I did walk away from that call thinking like there is no depth to that guy, which was always weird to me that like then the stories that came out of the governor's office about how he wanted a binder full of the executive powers, and this is a guy who carries the Federalist Papers around like a Bible or something. But yeah, it seemed to me from the very beginning this was a guy where like the mythology around him did not match the actual experience of him.
Definitely. There's an anecdote too, and I'll credit Adam Smith at the Tampa Bay Times. I think was the first person to ever have kind of put this anecdote out in the world, or this observation, that as a member of Congress, another thing that people noticed about him is that he would just kind of walk around the hallways with his earbuds popped in his ear, and,
Right.
and was like not jovial, did not engage anybody. I have heard versions of that anecdote from folks in North Florida, in different ways. I mean, he will sit in a room next to you and not say a word, and just
Right.
does not, like, genuinely does not seem interested in small talk or anything. I mean, and that's just that another thing, like when you ask me like what sort of went into this evaluation, that he's not probably going to resonate as well on a national level. Like that's just one of those that's always as far as I know, that's been a part of his general character for a long time. He's always just seemed like, it seems like, at a remove.
Right, right. It's also a good reminder too that like, for as diminished as like, print journalism and press corps have become, and Florida still has a pretty vibrant scene, but like there is nothing like national press attention when you run for national. And I think back, this is before my time, so I'm just like repeating a story I've heard, but like when Bob Graham was the governor in Florida and then senator from Florida for a long time, he had this habit where he wrote like every little detail of like his life into little notebooks. Like, and it would be stuff like, when he went to the grocery store, he'd make a note of it and like observations he had, what kind of cereal he bought that day, like all just like this complete. It was like a clearly kind of a tick type of thing. And in Florida, the press corps, who kind of knew him very well, that was kind of like that would be like an endearing quality in profiles and stuff like that, like an idea of like this guy's like he's like a normal guy, or he's just like he's down to earth sort of thing. But once he ran for president, that became like kind of is this the sort of guy we want trusted with the nuclear codes, right? Like it's just like the once you get onto that national stage, and there's just so much attention on you that it is very hard to say all these little like foibles that we all kind of like notice here, but don't really make too much of become like huge liabilities, I think.
Oh yeah. I mean, he was never going to, again, going back to the COVID days, especially, his press team did a very good job, touting these clips from news conferences where, he was the only one mic'd up and these,
Right.
reporters were not. And so their questions sounded really meek and you can barely hear it. And then he thunders back some response. And it made him
Right.
seem like this kind of populist firebrand. And like, not only was he very much not a populist firebrand in personality or in ideology, he, at a national level, that there is not that same sort of power imbalance as there is, when you go
Right.
to Manatee County and hold some COVID news conference. Like it's
Right.
not like that. You're not the one who gets to set narratives the same way. And so like his press team, I think they just kind of thought that's how they were just going to manhandle the national press the same way. And like, it just doesn't quite work like that.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, I used this before talking about someone else, but he's just a bully, right? A bully who got high on his own supply, and it was sort of fun to watch that the air come out of that balloon.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying, yeah, I mean, his whole team like molded in his image. I mean, they're just, he is hired, particularly his comms apparatus is just
Right.
this rogues gallery of ghouls. And
Right.
it's and like that is part of I think that is one reason his presidential campaign ended so terribly. They
Right.
just never had a competent media strategy.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. What else? I got you. We could talk UF Jacksonville, local elections. Anything on your mind? What should we do next?
Well, we've got, I mean, one of the cases in front of the Florida Supreme Court right now, there were oral arguments fairly recently over this Northeast Florida congressional district.
Oh, yeah, yeah, sure.
Yeah, so DeSantis eliminated an east-west Jacksonville to Tallahassee district that a former iteration of the Florida Supreme Court put in place. And he basically made it a Republican performing district that is designed to elect a white guy from some exurb in
Right.
Northeast Florida. This runs in violation of the Fair Districts Amendment, which voters overwhelmingly approved back in 2010. I think it's another example of DeSantis picking and choosing which laws he
Right.
wants to follow, which is probably not by coincidence an echo of the thing he accuses prosecutors of doing when he removes them. And it's another test of like how far is the Florida Supreme Court going to go and just kind of letting him do what he wants. I think the Florida Supreme Court is probably quite hostile to some of the policy outcomes that underpin the Fair Districts Amendment. But that's just another thing I've sort of gotten my eye on. And of course, Jacksonville has not been represented by a Black representative in Congress, or had been represented by a Black person in Congress for many decades, and now is not. Aaron Bean, a former state senator who lives in Nassau County, is now representing like parts of downtown Jacksonville and surrounding neighborhoods, and that's odd.
Game show host Aaron Bean. That for my money was every time I use one of these like absolutes, I end up like I think you once used this expression that the take ages like an avocado, but I I think that was the lowest moment for the Florida legislature was that whole process. Because if folks remember that the legislature, and Lord knows I've got my beefs with the decisions the Florida legislature's made this year and over the last 15 years that I've been 20 years that I've been covering them. But like one place they have generally been pretty good is like standing up to executive overreach and stuff like that. They're usually they got a pretty strong spine when they feel like people like the governor is trying to encroach on their territory. And like Jeb dealt with it, Rick Scott dealt with it, Charlie Crist dealt with it. And they started down that path with, because if you remember, the way that worked is Ron DeSantis wanted to wipe out that black access district in Jacksonville from the beginning. The legislature sort of knew it was unconstitutional and refused to do it, and they passed their own maps. DeSantis vetoed that, and then drew the maps himself, and the legislature just threw their hands up and passed the maps that DeSantis drew. It was like the weakest moment I've ever seen out of them. I'm curious if you agree, was that the lowest moment, or can you think of a lower moment? And then maybe we'll bring this back around to, you've been writing recently about, DeSantis's that phase of DeSantis seems to have passed, where we're starting to see pushback against him. I'm just sort of compare the DeSantis of then versus the DeSantis of now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good observation. And I will add that just like in the Amendment 4 case, I think that DeSantis has, he has a tendency to be so brazen that when he's in court, even in front of otherwise sympathetic judges, he creates such a bad set of facts that it makes it hard. It makes it harder than it should be for judges to agree with him. And in this case with redistricting, a map that the state house, a Jacksonville anchored district that they drew would have still provided Black voters in Jacksonville most of the time the ability to elect a representative of their choice. So it was a Jacksonville only district. So, DeSantis complained about the Jacksonville Tallahassee district not being compact or making sense. And I don't think that those are very good arguments, but even if you buy it, the legislature gave him a map that's just a Jacksonville based district that doesn't stretch all the way up to Nassau County, that still would offer, minority access representation. Right. And the existence of that district complicates the state's case in front of the Supreme Court. And so I don't know that that's going to be like, I think the Supreme Court is likelier in that case to give the governor what he wants than in like maybe the Amendment 4 case. But it's just a good example of him acting in ways that create bad facts for his lawyers to bring to judges. And so I would probably say, for my part, I think the meekest behavior in this kind of like the legislature letting the governor just kind of like stamp a boot on their face was probably this last budget. DeSantis vetoing all this arts and culture funding that the legislature approved, that is for groups in all of their communities. Right. And these are, symphonies and theaters and like things that like, these legislators probably feel very bad and very stupid that money got nixed. I think in a past era, the legislature would have called a special session to just reverse that by itself. But on top of that, the fact that DeSantis, and you were the one who really broke this story, having a weird issue with credit card fee with retailers in the process of wanting to veto that. He ended up nixing money for all the legislature's staff. And that's another one where they basically just their response was to more or less just pretend that didn't happen. Like, they won't even stand up for their own employees, call a special session and override this stuff. Like, it's also politically beneficial. Like, this would be good for you to restore arts and culture funding, restore funding for your staff, like, get it done, push back.
Right. Yeah, that's a really interesting observation, only in that, because one of the narratives that we came away from that session, and I say we, talking about like reporters and political reporters in Florida generally, but myself included, because I wrote some stories around this along these lines, is that this was the year the legislature pushed back, right? They started to throw some strings. They didn't give Richard Corcoran and New College all the money they wanted. They threw strings on stuff, DeSantis took a lot of L's in a way that was like unimaginable a year earlier. But you're right, then you get out of session, push comes to shove, when to really push back would have been to override the stuff. They refused to do it. They still sort of chickened out of there. So that's an interesting observation, that maybe the Florida legislature, it's found a vertebrae or two, but it hasn't found its full spine yet.
Yeah, well, it's like, is it, if it's not cowardice, it's laziness, it's just like abdication of basic responsibilities. I mean, a lot of these guys, they don't give a shit about public service, and that's not why they're doing this job. They would have called a special session to address these, like, these condo reforms already if they had any, if there wasn't even an ounce of concern about doing what's right by your constituents in the legislative leadership. They would have called a special session by now, and they just don't do it. They act like it's a big deal. Like, get your asses back to Tallahassee and do some work.
Right. Yeah, I think it is pretty clear that the only real sort of motivating factor for them and that sort of stuff is what's best for the elections, right? And they decided that, you know, overruling their own governor would be bad for Republicans in an election year. And so, sorry, even all my Republican friends in Sarasota who love the arts, sorry, you guys are screwed. And sorry for all the legislative employees that are looking at all sorts of uncertainty with that stuff. We can't rock the boat in an election year. So, okay, last thing for you, just because I've been trying to like amplify different races around the state. Are there any elections in Northeast Florida that you're paying attention to this November that like people might not be aware of but that are worth watching?
Well, with the caveat that I'm Jacksonville based and I've been a Jacksonville guy for a long time, so I'm not paying as much attention to local elections as I would
Hmm.
have, even a few months ago. I mean, the problem is like the congressional district is not going to be super
Right.
competitive. That would have, in a different world, that would have been one to watch. It's really more the court case in
Yeah.
that congressional race that I'm probably most interested in, and also seeing how, Duval County was once a Republican stronghold, has become much bluer over the years. At the same time, the exurbs have become redder, and so the region kind of tends to sort of cancel itself out sometimes in these statewide races. But Duval is basically a kind of purple city, especially in high turnout statewide races. And so I am going to be really curious about Amendment 4 and Amendment 3. What level of support do we see for that? And in the presidential level, Duval's not really the same bellwether that it used to be, but
Hmm.
it generally runs to the left of the state. And so if Kamala Harris is not, doing pretty well in Duval County, which we should know early on election night, that might be something to watch. Our demographics in this part of Florida are much more like the kind of the like Georgia political
Yeah.
landscape. And so I think Duval might be a decent bellwether in an odd way for like Georgia potentially, and maybe even North Carolina, where you have the politics are much more like the politics of deep South and kind of new South states.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. I never even thought about that. That right there is gonna make me much more interested in Duval County results than I would have been before. So, Nate Monroe, thank you for doing this. This is every time I talk to you, it's a lot of fun. So I appreciate you doing it on camera.
Yeah, likewise, man.
So, all right, I'll talk to you soon. All right, thank you again to Nate Monroe for joining the show. I'm definitely gonna have him back if he's willing to do it after this airs, because that was a fun conversation. Like I said, he's got lots of fascinating insights. You can find him at jacksonville.com. The Florida Times Union is where he's based, although he's the statewide columnist for all of USA Today's papers. So his stuff runs in, the Tallahassee Democrat, the Sarasota Herald Tribune, papers all over the state. Before we go, let's run through those plugs one more time. If you can, sign up for the newsletter. SeekingRentsFL.com is the easiest way to find us. And like I said, if you've got the means, think about voluntarily paying for a subscription. The money we get from that is enormously helpful. So we're super grateful for all our subscribers, but particularly are the folks who choose to pay for their subscription. Okay, we're gonna be back hopefully sooner. We're gonna try and pick up the pace of these episodes with the elections coming and just get more people and to riff on stories of the day and the elections as they unfold. So stay tuned for more episodes. And until then, thanks so much for listening.